Hello, everyone. Welcome to another nice, interesting session of the FHIR DevDays 2021. Today, we will have a look at multi-language support, and this is brought to you by Rene Spronk, which I learned today was the inventor of the FHIR acronym. So I'm handing over to you, Rene. Thank you for being here.
Yes, but you, yes, welcome. You have to add, obviously, that people blame me for all the FHIR puns, and I'm still not sure that Graham has gotten used to the acronym, but by now, he should probably be. So yes, welcome. So my name is Rene Spronk, and I work for FHIR as a trainer. As you know, FHIR does all sorts of stuff around FHIR, but I'm one of the trainers. And each and every dev days, I make it my aim as a trainer, you have to know a little bit about everything, to basically look at some aspects that I really haven't looked at in earnest before. And one of those is certainly multi-language support. What if you have to support multiple languages within one system, within one FHIR resource even? And especially in countries like Canada or Belgium or Switzerland that have multiple official languages by law, this is obviously a problem that's quite often faced by a lot of implementers. So yeah, what if you're faced with a multilingual environment? How do you actually deal with that? Well, you've read the blurb and it's repeated here as to what the intent of this presentation is. But certainly we're going to talk about language declaration. How do you actually define or flag, let's say, a resource or part thereof that you're using a certain language? The use of the language HTTP tag, obviously only valuable if you're in a RESTful environment. Terminologies and different translations, descriptions, for example, for codes. The translation in general and something on questionnaires. And we'll even look at some of the profiling resources, because obviously you can have implementation guides in multiple languages. Now, the thing is that, first of all, what we want to do is probably state or use multiple language snippets in one single resource. And by the way, most of the content of this presentation is actually taken from one single page in the spec, languages.html, although we have added a few additional things and some examples. Obviously, if you have multiple languages, then it could be that we're representing the same content multiple times in multiple different languages, or perhaps we're expressing different things in different languages, and then we may need to add automatic translations, for example. So first of all, let's start with the simple use case, the declaration of what language snippets we're actually using within a FHIR resource, for example. And the standard thing to use is obviously, which is part of, well, almost all FHIR resources, is the language in the, well, you could say the header of all resources. So language is kind of the default or base language that applies to all content of that particular FHIR resource. And here in our example, we see that it's typical internet way or RFC way of expressing, in this case, Dutch as spoken in Belgium. I told you Belgium is one of the prime examples because they have multiple official languages. You have to be aware, though, as it says here, taken from the standard, that if this language says that the base language is Dutch, spoken in Belgium, that does not mean that it automatically applies to the narrative. The narrative could very well have declared, again, some other language. So got to be careful there. But it is the base, if you want, the default language used in the contents of the resource. Another way of specifying what language you're using is to leverage one of the standard HTTP headers, content language. So in this case, we're expressing that in the context of some HTTP exchange, could be in an HTTP response, we're actually stating that the content language is English is spoken in the US in this example. and that again informs you. And obviously, if you declare a language within the FHIR resource and you have it in the HTTP header, then they should obviously match, because that's the base language of the communication. Now it gets a bit more tricky. Okay, there's a lot of tricky aspects here, but we start with the simple stuff. So narrative text. All resources, as you know, should have narrative text. It's not a shall, but a should, and that means that you have to have a very good reason not effectively to have narrative, and document that reason as to why you don't have narrative. But what if you have narrative in a specific language, or you want narrative to be present in multiple languages? Well, in this case, because it's a XHTML div section, we can use the XML lang value basically to specify here that we have two snippets of text. And one is, again, a Belgian example. One is a Dutch summary of the patient resource, and the other is a French version of the narrative. Now it's up to those that process the resource to either display all of the languages, or if the system is somehow language aware, and probably Belgium systems are language aware, then they know what context they're in or what language the user is using or the patient is using, and then they can display, they can select effectively the correct language from the list. But obviously you have to make sure, or you have to know, that there's going to be a list with translations for you to choose from. Another example here, and this is an English/Swedish example that I saw on chat.fhir.org, but it's the same principle. Here a JSON example, where again we have XHTML that declares either the text to be, in this case, the first example doesn't have an explicit language, so it's the base language of the resource, apparently English, but for Swedish it's explicitly declared, and at least Swedish systems will be able to then display only the Swedish part. Now we also have a language extension, and the language extension, predefined in the FHIR specification, can be used in any repeating item. So let's say you have multiple names or multiple instances of the address data type, then you are able to, using this extension, to flag the address or the name as being, this is the French expression of the name, or this is the Italian expression or the Swedish expression of the name or the address, or some other repeating structure. Okay, again, a Belgian address or a Belgian example, where we see that the address data element, which is present obviously in the core resource or as a core data element, and it's used repeatedly. So the structure definition, the profile has to allow for repeated addresses. And here one of the addresses is marked using the extension as being a French address. So we have 2 Avenue Gustave Latinis in Schaerbeek, and then we have also the Dutch expression, which switches the name of the street and the house number. So there may be various changes depending on the language or the cultural setting, if you want. Here, Gustave Latinislaan in Schaerbeek. And again, the receiver, as usual, can look at this list of addresses and not just select, well, I want the home address or the postal address, but they can also, in their selection procedure for picking the most relevant address, they can also use the value on the extension as to the language. Now, there's also an extension for translations. So you can add a translation, and if we look at the extension, then you see that it's a complex extension with language and with content in string or markdown. Okay, so then basically you can add, using this extension, you can add some string or some markdown version, some translation of some other content. So here we have the an example of the a value that is observed, observation value string, patient loves to sing, and let's say we wish to translate this into German. Well, this value string, that's not a repeating structure. So I cannot use the trick that we had on the addresses, that I will just add another address in a different language. Here I cannot add another value because there is only one in our FHIR resource. So here I have to use an extension that specifies that in German that the value string would be value string, right? Not value markdown, but value string is Patient singt gerne, which is the German translation of patient loves to sing. We have this example actually all over the place in the FHIR spec, and I'm still kind of curious as to why you would like to capture this fact that they love to sing. Perhaps they are not singing terribly well and they need to be in a single person room. I don't know what the joke here is, but we have this example in multiple places. But anyway, you can translate it if you want it using this extension. So now if you can declare a language, the base language of a FHIR resource, or let's say you can have multiple addresses and declare the language on that. Use the translation extension to add translations in a particular language. Then how can I, as a requester, let's say I'm requesting some clinical data or even a patient resource, how can I request that the server respond with a certain language? And again, if we're in a RESTful environment, obviously if you're not in a RESTful context, then you have to find a different means of doing this. But in a RESTful context, you can use the accept language HTTP header. Remember that we had content language on the as kind of a declaration side on the HTTP header, but on a request I can use accept language to specify give me the data in German. And the server can then basically, based on what's in the FHIR resource, could actually filter out all stuff that's not in German. Let's say we have Swedish and German in this FHIR resource. Well, we strip out all the Swedish stuff and only return the German stuff. Okay. Or perhaps the server is smart enough to do some automatic translation. And obviously this won't be possible for everything. But certainly when it comes to, let's say, a summary of the patient resource, you can probably write some software that would automatically generate a reasonable, human-readable expression in many different languages. And this accept language would also be very handy if you're doing search, URL-based search. Let's say you're supplying, I'm searching on the patient street name. But then you have to involve the fact, well, is that in my Belgian example, should that be part of the Dutch address or be part of the French address? Because the street names are different, or at least have been translated. So this has a direct impact on the search capabilities of a server as well, or should have a direct impact. I did ask around on chat.fhir.org, as you know, where most of the community is nowadays, whether anybody already supports this of the larger test servers that we know of. And actually, it's mostly on their to-do list. In other words, they don't actually support this right now. So there has not been a lot of demand. And actually, if you look at the number of attendees of this particular session, then again, perhaps you see that the interest is mainly in certain languages, but in certain areas, but countries, but not in others. Let's also go for code systems and value sets. Obviously, that's a very specific area because code system definitions may actually contain multiple designations, multiple descriptions. And So if a code system like SNOMED, for example, they have multiple language descriptions and alternative designations. And that means that this is a very good base, basically, for our translations. If we have a code, then using a code system that contains descriptions in multiple languages, I can obviously do a lookup and basically effectively translate a code. So here we're looking at a snippet from a resource that has base language English. And in that resource, or in this code system, we have DE as an acronym for German. Okay. But in Russian, German is obviously not German, but it's this, right? And in, I think this is Chinese, they actually have this. It all means German, but the description is given in a different language. So a very nice feature to use in translations, but also very useful if you're going to do value set expansions. And the $expand operation, which is what you use to turn effectively a code system into a value set, and the value set is used, for example, for validation. The expand operation, you can have a parameter, and the parameter is language. So basically what you're asking the terminology server to do is to create a value set that contains only the terms in a specific language. And that could be just Swedish, but it could be a bit more specialized than that. Quite a lot of terminologies may have patient-friendly terms. So we're not going to use complex Latin descriptions, which is fine for clinicians perhaps, but we want to use more lay terms for, so it may not just be Swedish, it may be Swedish for clinicians and Swedish for patients. And again, those are just different languages, different expressions, if you want, within a code system, and you can effectively expand based on the language or the context. Typically what we're seeing is, and that's the recommendation, is that people create a value set, or they create an expanded value set for each and every language that they have to deal with. And then they persist the value set on a per language basis. And that tends to be a best practice that, at least I've seen that in quite a lot of projects. As for automatic translation, and obviously this is going to happen, and as I alluded to before, it's actually not that tricky, certainly not for administrative resources. If you do this at runtime, then obviously there is, with all translation, there is a bit of a patient safety risk because you may have false translations. When it comes to coding systems, value sets or questionnaires or other registry type resources, then we tend to see that people translate them in a particular language and then persist a language specific version. So that leads me to the conclusion that you see near the bottom here, is that there are some resources. If resources are likely to be frequently updated, then it's probably best to do a runtime translation each and every time when somebody fetches the resource. But resources that are very stable, that are unlikely to be ever updated, then it may be much better to perform a once-off translation and persist the translated version. And if then somebody asks for, give me the Russian or the Swedish or whatever language version, then you just basically return that particular language specific resource from cache or something. Well, effectively it will appear to come from cache. Special thing is around questionnaires, because questionnaires could obviously be created to be for people that or for an audience that is comprised of people that speak different languages. And there are two options that I've seen in discussions is, yes, you can create one monstrously big questionnaire and basically add all languages to it. So for each and every question that you have in the questionnaire, you add extensions with all of the various language versions of the questions. and the answer sets, because the value sets that are matching your questions may be different as well. Okay, but questionnaires already have mostly quite a few extensions. So if you add multiple languages to it, you turn a questionnaire into one big heap of extensions. That may not be manageable, as is noted here. What we've also seen in some projects is that in option 2, they want to go for language-specific FHIR questionnaires. And in order to do that, they have some master template for the questionnaire, which includes all of the questions and the answers in all of the various languages that they wish to support. But this master template that I've seen is sometimes it's non-FHIR. So what they want to do is to create a master that contains all of the complexity, transform it into the language-specific questionnaires, one questionnaire for Swedish, one for English, etc., and persist those questionnaires. And this still allows you, or has the benefit that if you want to modify the master, because you have a new question or whatever, and then you can still automatically generate effectively all the language-specific questionnaires. So when it comes to questionnaires, we're seeing a similar behavior than as we've seen when it comes to value sets, that apparently projects prefer to create language-specific instances of those resources instead of having one very complex resource that contains all of the languages. Now, one further area, and this is not touched upon as far as I saw on the language page in the FHIR spec, is on the structure definitions. Because structure definitions, or profiles, as you well know, are the basis for implementation guides. If you look at them on simplify.net, for example, then you see the annotations as to how certain data elements should be used or may be used. So again, if you have a multilingual audience when it comes to implementation guides and profiling, then you'll have to do something in structure definitions as well. And that's a bit tricky because structure definitions, well, yeah, you can have a base language again. But there is one thing that tends to be helpful is that there is an extension which is called translatable. And it's a Boolean. And as you guessed it, this is an extension that at least allows you to flag a certain data element as this is something that is translatable or has translations if you want. Now, how is this used? And this is actually from an international vendor who uses it in production in this fashion. Is let's say they have a structure definition for some resource type X. And that's their standard profile across all languages. So they have one profile that's valid across all of the languages. Then if there are data elements in there that you're allowed to use, then some of those data elements will be of a data type where some translation may be in order. And what they're doing is basically flagging those as translatable. And then you can basically, once you flag them as translatable, what they do is to create another profile. And this is a language-specific version of the profile we see here, but it's a differential view. So the only thing they do is they specialize the generic one a bit more to be a language-specific one, and also have the specific guidance, in this case, in that specific language on element A and element B. Okay, so they have a two-level approach in order to basically, the language is effectively a constraint, if you want. The language-specific version is a constraint on the non-language specific version of the profile. And I think it's actually a fairly elegant solution to deal with this, so that they can still have one effectively master definition and derive definitions for each and every language. So again, we're seeing a similar approach as we saw in questionnaires, and when it comes to value sets, that they prefer to create, have one master version effectively that combines all of the languages, but then create persisted versions of language specific, in this case, structure definitions. Obviously, if you create an implementation guide, then you can specify the language, and hopefully the IG builder or tools like that, actually I don't know, I haven't tested that, will actually filter based on that language. Also on the guidance that we have in structure definitions. So to summarize, because we left some time at the end for discussion, is yes, definitely the basis of all of this is to use language declarations in resources, either in the HTTP header or in the language tag or using extensions, because then at least the receiver can detect that various languages have been used. Add a list of translations where appropriate. Otherwise, the receiver or the server may have to add their own automatic translations. And the best translation is obviously one provided by the source, the author of the resource, and not by a server that does an automatic translation. In general, persist language-specific versions of expanded value sets, questionnaires, and as we've seen on the previous slide, structure definitions. And for servers that expose a FHIR API to support the accept language HTTP header, so that a client can actually request a specific language. Right, so that in brief is our overview of the various aspects around language and multi-language support in FHIR. I'm looking at the Q&A on the Whova website. Regarding dates, is it always expected that any application presenting FHIR dates would use the ISO format from FHIR and then present the date in the local format? Short answer, yes. Okay, so the data type in FHIR is fixed in a particular format, and how you display this in, let's say, a particular locale, that's entirely up to you. So that's not predefined in FHIR how you should display that. How is a server expected to use the language extension with search results or sort parameters? Well, that's a nice one. I would expect that this is a language extension. Well, obviously, this has an impact. If you request a certain language to be used in a response, that's not part of the question here that was created by Robert Johnson. But if you have a specified language in a request, then that probably has an impact on all sorts of things in when it comes to search capabilities. Because let's say, give me all patients sorted by their address or something. Just making something up. Then if you set it in my Belgian-Dutch example, then or a French-Dutch example, and you state that I only want to use the French addresses, then obviously that sorts differently than if you state I only want to have the Dutch addresses. So I fully expect languages, if you specify a language in a request, that to have a major impact on not all of the data types, but certainly the data types that can be translated. Not sure if that answered that. So Robert Johnson, you can unmute yourself. You're allowed to unmute in this discussion. We can follow up to see whether this responded or this answered your question.
Thank you. That did address my question.
Okay, excellent. So has anybody else any questions, or have you implemented multi-language support yourself already?
Hey Rene, it's Graham. I've been going through doing multi-language support for value set expansion last week, narrowing down all the use cases. There's plenty of different variations. But I think the search question you just talked about is something I've never heard discussed before. I certainly couldn't search on different languages differently. Something for me to think about.
Well, I think it's unavoidable, and it's actually mentioned. I don't know whether I picked this up from the specification itself or from one of the discussions on Zulip, but there has been discussion on specifically this aspect as to what impact some sort of language parameter or the HTTP header should have on search. But yes, definitely, looking at the question that Robert Johnson asked. I'm also scratching my head and going like, well, there's not a lot of guidance right now on this, but we'd better give this some thought if we take multi-language support seriously.
Yeah, somebody might want to bring that up on chat.fire.org. And then the other thing I want to mention is that at some stage, we have multi-language support in the validator right now, the Java validator. And at some stage this year, our intention is that we'll start working on multi-language IG support in the IG publisher.
Well, that would be excellent, specifically, as I stated, for a language for countries that really have to deal from a legal standpoint with multiple languages. So,
yeah.
There is a question that I don't know the answer to on the Q&A, which is, can you tell something how the translation is meant to be used in the IPS?
I don't know anything about that.
So maybe Walter, could you unmute yourself and elaborate a bit?
Well, it's meant to be used translation extension. And if you look at that, you mentioned something, but I don't really understand it. You can use the markup, but also you can just use a string. You indicate the translation extension, the language, the code.
Yes.
And then you can use a language or a string or a markup. Your example is markup, but
no, actually, the example here is a value string. So my my translation, because the original one is a string, that's probably why the translation is also a string. But that's not mandatory at all. If this were to be a string, then this could be markdown. Or even if the value was an integer, value integer or something, this could still be value markdown.
But how is it meant? If I go to Botswana and there the tiger, the lion is biting me, so I'm supposed to be able to ask for my international patient summary back in Switzerland, and then they it comes, and then what is supposed to be there?
Well, I'm not an IPS expert, but in general, the approach in such international projects typically is that you would include a code, potentially from SNOMED, for the concept of a lion or tiger, and then locally in Switzerland, you would do a translation using the code to whatever the German or French code or language description is for the concept code for tiger or lion. So obviously in Botswana, they're not going to create a German or French translation of the word tiger. That's not how this works.
No, but the Swiss authorities, for any country authorities, have to provide a repository or something where the IPSs are stored, and then they have to provide it with, I'd say, the most common languages, or that's the idea there. So
well, I don't know. As I told you,
the guy in Botswana understands what
yes, but
this
is an IPS specific question, so I'm unable to answer that since I'm not an IPS expert. So you'll have to forgive me. Yeah. So I'll have to ask the remaining attendees if somebody else on this call actually knows the answer to this one. It's an IPS specific question. And if nobody basically pops up, then I would urge you to ask this on chat.fhir.org. As you probably know, they have an IPS stream on chat.fhir.org. So that would be the appropriate group to ask in this case.
We'll ask for person.
Yeah, sorry about that. Trainers know a little bit about everything, but IPS is not on my list right now, unfortunately.
I hope to get an answer to this, but it's difficult.
I suggest you ask this on the IPS channel on chat.fhir.org.
That's exactly what my suggestion was, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was
Alrighty, you're multitasking again, probably, Graham. Anyway, so are there any other questions or comments on this multi-language support? If not, then thanks very much. Be aware that I will be responding to the Q&A questions. I will type the answers there as well for some of you who may wish to review those at some later point in time. The slides will be shared. So at some future point in time, let's hope we know more about the impact of languages on search, which is still an open item apparently for discussion. And I wish you good luck with your implementations in multilingual contexts. So thanks again, and see you around for some other session.
Thank you, Rene. Great talk.
Thank you. Bye-bye.